Ernest Shackleton was born February 15, 1874 in Kelkia, Ireland. He moved to South London 10 years later to the suburbs with his family. His first taste of polar exploration was from 1901 to 1904 with Robert Scott's Discovery Expedition. He suffered from scurvy during this expedition, although other reasons have been given as possibilities in recent times. From 1907 to 1909, he led the Nimrod expedition into Antarctica, reaching latitude 88 degrees 23 south, falling just 112.2 miles short of reaching the South Pole, a new record, the longest South Pole journey to date. During this expedition, other members of his team climbed Mount Erebus. For these achievements, he was knighted by King Edward VII, but he was never able to achieve the title as the first person to reach the South Pole. In 1911, Roald Amundsen beat him to it. Now, the year is 1912. Woodrow Wilson is elected president. New Mexico and Arizona become states. The Titanic sinks on her maiden voyage. Gasoline was 18 cents a gallon, and the ship that would become the Endurance was built. Originally named Polaris, she was 144 feet long, was 350 tons, had a 25-foot beam, a top speed of 10.2 knots, propelled by sail and coal-fired steam, and produced 350 horsepower. She was designed for polar expeditions. Every joint and fitting was cross-braced. She was built to ferry tourists and hunting parties into the Arctic. With 10 passenger cabins, a dining saloon and galley, a smoking room, a dark room, she had electric lighting, and even a bathroom. Her keel was made from 4 pieces of solid oak, stacked up upon one another, 85 inches thick. Her sides were built at double thickness between 18 and 30 inches, made from planks of oak, Norwegian fir, and sheathed in greenheart. Her bow was designed to break through the ice. Each timber in the bow was made from an entire oak tree, chosen specifically for its curve so it would naturally bend with the ship. The bow's thickness was 52 inches. She had 3 masts. She was one of the strongest wooden ships ever built at the time of her launch in 1912. She was built for Adrian de Gerlache and Lars Christensen, but financial problems led Christensen to sell the ship. After 1 year, she was still not sold. During this time, Ernest Shackleton was planning a new expedition, since the race to the South Pole was over. He planned to make the first ever land crossing of the Atlantic continent. It was named the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. He needed a ship, and Christensen needed the Polaris sold. So in January of 1914, Shackleton purchased her for £14,000, barely enough to cover the payments to the shipyard. But it is said Christensen was happy to take the loss in order to further the plans of an explorer of Shackleton's stature. He didn't have the funds at the moment, but Christensen was so eager to sell her, he paid the deposit himself. She was rechristened Endurance, after the Shackleton family motto, "By endurance we conquer." Shackleton had trouble getting financial backing for his expedition at first, but he eventually received a £10,000 grant from the British government. He thought he would need £50,000, about £5 million today. He chose to solicit funding from wealthy backers. He received £1,000 from the Royal Geographical Society, $50,000 from J.M. Barrie, a former rival of Shackleton. Dudley Docker gave him £10,000. Janet Stamcombe Wills gave an unknown amount. James Caird gave £24,000. He now had all the funding he would need for his 1914 expedition. He bought the ship the Aurora, his second ship to complete his plan. His expedition's goal was to consist of 2 parties. The Weddell Sea party would be aboard the Endurance, go to Vassal Bay, 14 men would land, 6 under Shackleton would form the Transcontinental party, with 69 dogs, 2 motor sledges, and equipment. They would undertake the 1,800-mile journey to Ross Sea. The remaining men would stay at the shore and do scientific work, 3 to Graham Land, 3 to Enderby Land, and 2 at base camp. The other ship, the Ross Sea Party, would base at McMurdo Sound on the opposite side of the continent. They would lay depots on the route for the Transcontinental Party, as far as the Beardmore Glacier, meeting the party and assisting them back. Supposedly, Shackleton took out an ad in the paper that stated, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. Ernest Shackleton." It is unknown if this ad was myth or not. The crew of the Endurance was made up of 28 men, including Sir Ernest Shackleton, expedition leader, Frank Wild, second in command, Frank Worsley, captain and navigator, Lionel Greenstreet, first officer, Tom Crean, second officer, Alfred Cheatham, third officer, Hubert Hudson, navigator, Lewis Rickinson, engineer, Alexander Kerr, engineer, Alexander Macklin, surgeon, James Elroy, surgeon, Sir James Wordie, geologist, Leonard Hussey, meteorologist, Reginald James, physicist, Robert Clark, biologist, Frank Hurley, photographer, George Marston, artist, Thomas Ord Lace, motor expert and storekeeper, Chippy McNish, carpenter, Charles Green, cook, Walter Howe, able seaman, William Bakewell, able seaman, Timothy McCarthy, able seaman, Thomas McLeod, able seaman, John Vincent, boatswain, Ernest Holness, stoker, William Stevenson, stoker, Pierce Blackborough, steward. They embark on the maiden voyage. They sail from Plymouth on August 8, 1914, just 4 days after Britain declared war on Germany during World War I. They were headed to Buenos Aires, Argentina, under the command of Worsley. Shackleton stayed back in Britain, finalizing some final preparations. This was their first maiden voyage. Many of the crew considered her too rounded for the open sea. Shackleton took a steamer to Buenos Aires and met up with his crew. On 26 of October 1914, the Endurance sailed to Grifton on the island of South Georgia, a whaling station and the largest settlement on the island, at the head of King Edward Cove in the Cumberland East Bay. They arrived on the 5th of November. They stayed exactly 1 month and left the station on the 5th of December 1914, headed for the Weddell Sea. They made good time until the second day when the Endurance encountered pack ice. The progress slowed to a crawl. She averaged less than 30 miles per day for weeks on end. By January 15, 1915, the Endurance was 200 miles away from Vauxhall Bay. On the 16th of January, a gale blew in. Deep pack ice was sighted. The Endurance took shelter under an iceberg. For 2 days they left to try to find a path, but returned to the safety of the grounded iceberg. On the 18th of January, the gale had blown away the ice. The topsail was set and the engines on slow. They made progress until the ice loomed again in the distance. The decision was made to try and work through the ice pack. They entered the ice at 5 p.m. The Endurance became stuck in the ice. The gale increased, blowing the ship south. This continued for 6 days. By the 24th of January, the southerly winds blew the ice into the Weddell Sea against the land. The Endurance was trapped in the ice as far as the eye could see in every direction. The only thing they could do was wait for the wind to shift and open up the ice. That morning, a crack in the ice appeared, 50 yards in front of the ship, 15 feet across and 1 mile long. On the 26th, the crack was a quarter mile wide, giving the men hope that the ice was breaking up. Unfortunately, it never reached the ship. The ship under full sail and the engine at full for 3 hours proved to be foolhardy. They did not budge. More breaks in the ice were spotted, but they all closed up within a few hours. They were stuck until February 14th. They saw an open channel of water a quarter mile ahead. At first light, they realized the Endurance was floating now in a small pool of young ice surrounded by a thick plate of ice 12 feet thick. Shackleton ordered the men to saw and hack a path through the ice to reach the channel. They made it 150 yards. After a day, they worked another day, but the pack was moving. so Shackleton decided to ram their way through the pack ice. The ship got a full head of steam and went back as far as they could so they could make up the most speed. But the ship could not reach a high enough speed to break out of the ice. At 3 p.m., Shackleton weighed the risks of damage to the ship and strain on the men and the depleting coal reserves. He made the call and halted the attempt to break out of the ice. It was decided to extinguish the boilers and wait until the ice let go of the ship. The ship had drifted within 60 miles of Vassall Bay. Shackleton contemplated leaving the ship and taking everything and marching over the ice to Vassall Bay, but he thought better of that idea. By March, the ship was stuck in the ice, and the drift increased speed, traveling 130 miles from March to May. When the dark, sunless winter began on July 14th, a blizzard hit the stranded ship. Winds increased to 70 miles per hour, and temperatures plummeted to negative 33 degrees Fahrenheit. It lasted for 2 days. The blizzard broke up the pack ice into smaller sections. This let the different sections move independently of one another and let them pile up against itself. Cracking was observed, but none were close enough to the Endurance. In July, she drifted 160 miles. On August 1st, a wave passed through the floe, lifting the Endurance upwards and towards her port side. She broke free, dropping into a pool of water, afloat again after 6 months being trapped in the ice. But the broken sheets of ice floe encroached to the ship and surrounded her, violently crashing into her from all sides. After 25 minutes, a floe hit her stern, pushing her bow up onto the ice and lifting her 5 degrees to the port. Another storm hit overnight, forcing more ice up against the starboard side at a 45-degree angle against the ship's scuppers. Fortunately, she remained undamaged, a true test to her strength. More waves struck the ice pack on August 29th, causing no damage. On August 31st, the ice shifted, causing the wood to creak. The ice broke and shifted through the night. For another month, the seas were calm, but the ship was not set free. By September 30th, signs of spring arrived, 10 hours of daylight, and a few readings of temperatures being above freezing. When a large sheet of ice was swept up against the bow, the ship made horrible creaking noises. The ship's carpenter, Chippy McNish, was sent to inspect the ship's damage. He noted the solid oak beams supporting the deck were bent like a piece of cane. On the deck, the masts were whipping back and forth. Their points on the keel were distorted. Worsley stated, "Just as it appears, she can't stand no more. The huge floe, weighing possibly 1,000,000 tons or more, yields to our little ship by cracking across, and so relieves the pressure. The behavior of our ship in the ice has been magnificent. Undoubtedly, she is the finest little wooden vessel ever built." Despite this, the decks on the ship were buckling, showing real signs of damage. By October, temperatures were up to 29 degrees, and the ice showed signs of opening up. The floe against the ship's starboard side broke up on October 14th, causing the Endurance to float again for the first time in 9 months. On October 16th, Shackleton ordered the boilers lit. It took 4 hours for the ice to melt in the boilers, when a leak was discovered on one of the fittings. The water was pumped out, the leak was repaired, and filled with water again. On the 17th, an opening was seen in the ocean, but only one boiler had been lit, and not enough steam to run the engine. So the sails were raised, but the ship couldn't make it out of the ice. By October 18th, the ice closed around the ship again. After only 5 seconds, the ship listed to port by 20 degrees and then 30 degrees, the bulwarks resting on the ice and the lifeboats swinging above the ice, hanging from their davits. The ship trapped like this for 4 hours, but the ice receded and she returned upright. More waves hit the ship on the 24th of October, pinning her again to the ice floes. A sheet struck the stern, ripping the stern post away from the hull and the forward hold. Both of the portable pumps on the ship were used. The same moment, the planking on the bows was stoved in, causing the engine room to flood. Both of the portable pumps on the ship were being used while building up steam for the main bilge pump. Despite this, the water continued to rise. The man-powered deck pumps did not work, their intakes were frozen. The only way to fix this was to pour buckets of boiling water on the pipe pumps and using a blowtorch on their intake valve. McNish made a cofferdam to seal off the damaged area. The crew used the main man pump for 15 minutes on and 15 minutes off for each man. They struggled for 28 hours. The water had been stopped, but the ship was still badly flooded. Shackleton ordered that all the ship's lifeboats, stores, and essential equipment be moved onto the ice surrounding the battered ship. The ship's planking on the port side was pushed in by 6 inches. The temperatures ranged from -16 at night to -8 during the day. On the evening of October 27th, Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship. The ship's position was noted. The next day, parties were sent aboard to recover more supplies from the ship. They saw that the entire port side of the ship had been driven inwards, and the ice had entirely filled the bow and the stern section. Only one of the 6 cabins survived. The rest had been punctured by the ice. Shackleton wrote, "The entire aft of the ship had been crushed, concertina fashion. The forward engine was now in the galley. The gas cans that were on the deck were now pushed through the deckhouse wall, halfway into the wardrobe. The ship's blue ensign was hoisted on her mizzenmast. In Shackleton's words, he did this so she would go down with colors flying. An attempt was made to man-haul the sledges across the ice, but Shackleton realized it was too much to ask of the men. They would have to camp on the ice until it broke up. More parties went inside the Endurance to gather more supplies, but 2 days after abandoning her, the ship sunk up to the forecastle. A large amount of supplies was left on the submerged lower deck. The only way to retrieve these items was to cut through the main deck, which was more than a foot thick and under 3 feet of water. Once the hole was cut, some of the supplies floated up to the surface. Other supplies were reached with a grapple. They recovered 3.5 tons of supplies from the wrecked ship. Shackleton planned a march to one of 3 places: Paulet Island, Snow Hill Island, or Robertson Island. From there, they would travel across Graham Land and get to the whaling outpost in Wilmington Bay. Worsley calculated the distance to Snow Hill Island to be 312 miles, 346 miles to Paulet Bay, and a further 120 miles to the whaling outpost. Worsley thought the march much too risky, and that they should wait on the ice for it to carry them to open water and then escape in the lifeboats. But Shackleton overruled him. Before the march could begin, he ordered all the weakest animals to be shot. They set off by the 30th of October 1915, with 2 lifeboats on sledges being pulled by the men. Problems quickly arose. The ice was anything but smooth, and in just 3 days they traveled only 2 miles. Shackleton then abandoned the march. The party camped 2 miles from the Endurance. On November 8th, Shackleton returned to the ship. Another attempt was made to salvage supplies, but the ship had sunk even further. The deck was covered in water, and the interior of the ship was full of ice and snow. This last attempt was abandoned. Another wave hit the pack ice on November 13th. The remaining masts that were above the water now collapsed, and the bow was crushed. The final moments of the ship were recorded on film by Frank Hurley, the ship's photographer. The 21st of November, the final pieces of the Endurance still above the water were hit by another wave. The stern was lifted out of the water, the ice came apart, and the Endurance sunk. The expedition was abandoned with the sinking of the ship. Shackleton's focus now shifted to the survival of his men. By late November, the ice was traveling 7 miles a day. On the 5th of December, they passed 68 degrees south, and going slightly northeast, Paulet Island was 250 miles away, the closest island to the north. Shackleton wanted to reduce the length of the lifeboat journey that it would take to reach it. On the 21st of December, he told the crew another march would begin in 2 days. Conditions had not improved, and the temperatures were uncomfortably warm. The snow on the ice had become soft, causing the men to sink to their knees. By the 27th, Chippy McNish rebelled. He refused to work and argued that Admiralty law had elapsed since the sinking of the Endurance, and that he was no longer under orders. Shackleton would not stand for disobedience, and he quickly put the carpenter back in line. Shackleton never forgave insubordination, and he would never forget this moment. 2 days later, they traveled only 7.5 miles in 7 full days. Shackleton halted the march, stating it would take us over 300 days to reach the land. The crew set up camp, with Shackleton naming it Patience Camp. where they would stay for more than 3 months. Supplies were running low. Hurley and Macklin were sent back to the original camp to recover the food that they had left behind to lighten their march. On February 2, 1916, a large party was sent back to recover the third lifeboat. Food shortages began, and seal meat, which had added variety to their diet, now became a staple of survival. In January, all but 2 of the remaining teams of dogs from the dog sled team were put down to conserve food. On April 2nd, the other 2 teams were put down. The drifting of the ice became erratic by March 17th. There were 60 nautical miles from Paulet Island. Shackleton stated, "It might have been 600 for all the chance we had of escaping it across the broken sea ice." The party had land in sight continuously now. Mount Haddington on James Ross Island remained in view as they drifted by. They were now too far north for Snow Hill or Paulet Island to be reachable. Shackleton now hoped on reaching one of 2 small islands at the end of Graham Land, Clarence Island or Elephant Island, around 100 nautical miles north of their position on the 25th of March. On the evening of April 8th, the floe suddenly split open. Patience Camp was now on a small triangular raft of ice. If this broke up, it would be disastrous. Shackleton ordered the lifeboats readied. They would try for Deception Island if possible. Shackleton had heard that a wooden church had been erected for the whalers. It could be a source of wood so they could construct a better boat. The 3 lifeboats were named the Dudley Docker, James Caird, and Stancomb Wills. The 3 lifeboats were launched between 1 and 2 p.m. on April 9th. Shackleton captained the James Caird, Worsley the Dudley Docker, and navigating officer Herbert Hudson was in charge of the Stancomb Wills. Herbert Hudson was having a mental breakdown, so effectively Tom Crean was in charge as they left. As they left, the lifeboats were surrounded by ice. Progress was slow and perilous. Sometimes they got out and brought the boats up on the floes to keep them from being bashed into pieces. Other times they tied them to the floes. Shackleton was unsure about what island to head to, and the conditions in the lifeboat were taking a toll on the men, tearing them down physically and mentally. Finally, Shackleton decided they would head for Elephant Island. It was the closest option. By April 14th, they made it off the southeast coast of Elephant Island, but the shore was covered in perpendicular cliffs and glaciers. The James Caird rounded the eastern point of the island. The 3 boats had been separated the night before. The James Caird saw a narrow shingle beach. The boats reunited at the beach. The tide rose to the top of the beach, making this site unable to support a camp. The next day, one of the boats explored to try to find a landing site. They returned having found a large split of land 7 miles to the west. The 3 boats set off. They reached the new beach that they called Cape Wild. Elephant Island was remote, uninhabited, and rarely visited by whalers, or any other ships for that matter. If the party was going to be rescued, it would have to be summoned. It was decided one of the lifeboats would have to be adapted to survive a voyage across the Southern Ocean to South Georgia, an 800-mile journey. Shackleton told the men of his plan and asked for volunteers. Many of the men were eager to make the journey. A large amount of the party was in poor health, suffering from frostbite and mentally unfit, having barely survived the short lifeboat trip from the ice, let alone an open boat journey across the open ocean. Chippy McNish was pivotal in building the lifeboat to survive an open ocean crossing. Scavenging parts, McNish raised the lifeboat sides, covered the boat with canvas deck, and filled the seams with oil paints and seal's blood. On April 24, 1916, the ramshackle James Caird was launched. The lifeboat party consisted of Shackleton, Worsley, Crean, McNish, Vincent, McCarthy. Wild was left in charge of the party at Elephant Island, with instructions to make for Deception Island the following spring if Shackleton did not return. The lifeboats took supplies for only 4 weeks. Shackleton figured if land had not been reached by then, the boat would be lost. The lifeboat was 22.5 feet long. The voyage depended on pinpoint accuracy from Worsley's navigation skills. The first night, they steered north by the stars, in extremely unfavorable conditions. Everything was soaked in the boat in the rough seas. Ice formed on everything. On May 5th, a northwest gale almost destructed the boat, from what Shackleton described as one of the largest waves he had ever seen in 26 years. The subarctic ocean lived up to its evil reputation. Of the 6 men, they took turns. While 3 were up steering the ship, the other 3 were in the flooded hold under the soaking canvas, getting what little freezing rest they could manage. While Shackleton was in charge of the journey, Worsley was the most important member of the little boat. Being the navigator, it was up to him to locate South Georgia Island. The strong winds propelled the tiny boat up to 50 miles a day, but he needed clear skies to use his sextant to determine the longitude and latitude. Otherwise, they could travel hundreds of miles off course. After 6 days, the sun shines, and Worsley takes a measurement. The tiny ship had sailed 238 miles. Another gale struck the boat. McNish was suffering horribly, but he was tasked with breaking the ice off the ship, which was nearly sinking from the added weight. After 11 days, the storm subsided. An albatross was spotted in the sky, a good omen for mariners. Worsley did the math and calculated they traveled 496 miles. Precision was key from this point forward, if they were to reach the island. The next day, the boat traveled 96 miles. Worsley predicted they could be just 2 days from the island. Their water was tainted with salt, and the overcast made it impossible to get an accurate reading. On the 15th day, seaweed was spotted on the waves, a definite sign of land. At 12:30, McCarthy spotted land and cried, "Land ho!" The party was driven to their limits. Hurricane-force winds struck the boat offshore. Worsley pulled the boat away from the rocks to sit tight and wait for the winds to slow. The next day they sailed back to the shore and landed at King Haakon Bay. Their journey was far from over. The whaling station was at the opposite side of the island. They would either have to make another boat journey across the island or through the unexplored interior of the island. The condition of the boat and the condition of the men, mainly Vincent and McNish, meant that a journey by land was the only real option. They rested for 5 days and took the battered boat a short distance deep into a bay where they would start their journey. Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean would take on the journey, and the others would remain at the camp, which they named the Peggotty Camp. The others would be picked up after they made it to the whaling station. They were delayed on May 18th, but at 2 o'clock the following morning the weather calmed, and by 3 they set off on their journey. 26 miles to Stromness was their destination. The interior of the island was unexplored and unmapped. A closer station was just 6 miles north, but as far as they knew, it was only inhabited during the summer months, so Stromness was the destination. The journey began. They had ascended 3,000 feet. They were above Possession Bay, but could see the coast now, and they needed to backtrack to the east, the first of many backtracks. They were on a high mountainside, and they needed to reach the valley by nightfall. Foolishly, they risked it all by sliding down the mountainside on a makeshift rope sledge. They continued without rest towards the gap in the next mountain ridge. On May 20th, they could see Husvik Harbor below, and they knew they were on track. At 7 a.m., they listened carefully, watching their chronometer, knowing a steam whistle would summon the whalers to work. Right on time, they could hear the sound off in the distance. The first man-made sound other than the expedition that they had heard since 1914. After a terrifying descent which involved scaling a frozen waterfall, they finally reached safety after 36 hours over unnamed mountains and glaciers. When the survivors arrived in Stromness Station, Shackleton's first point of interest was to arrange a rescue mission for his 3 companions at Peggotty Camp to be picked up. A whaling ship was sent around the coast with Worsley aboard to show the crew the way. On the evening of the 21st, all 6 of the James Caird party were safe and in Stromness Station. After Shackleton's departure from Elephant Island, John Wild took command. He led a difficult life on land with problems of drink, but at sea he took to his own. He knew how to follow orders. Many of the men were in a horrible state. Lewis Rickinson had suffered a heart attack. Pierce Blackborough was unable to walk due to his bleeding, frostbitten feet. Many of the men were suffering horribly from frostbite, and others were on the brink of a mental breakdown. Some had already gone insane. 21 men in all stayed back at Elephant Island. The treeless island had no shelter, so the main priority of the party was to make a shelter by scavenging supplies and using the lifeboats and canvas left over. A hut they nicknamed the Snuggery was improvised by upturning 2 lifeboats, placing them on a low stone wall to provide 5 feet of overhead room. The ground was cold and frozen, and the fire burned their eyes, but it provided some shelter from the elements. Wilde estimated that it would take a month for their rescue. He initially refused the stockpiling of seal and penguin meat because this was a defeatist point of view. As the weeks passed by, Wilde established and maintained routines and activities to relieve the men of their own minds, which were slowly failing. He established a permanent lookout to search for the rescue ship. Cooking and housekeeping rotations were established, as well as hunting trips for seal and penguin. Concerts were held on Saturdays, and anniversaries were celebrated to maintain normalcy for the men. But as time passed and there were no signs of rescue, the men became despondent. On June 15th, Blackborough's left foot became gangrenous from frostbite. The surgeons, Macklin and McElroy, made the decision that it had to be amputated. At first, no chloroform could be found. The amputation would have to be completed without anesthetic. But luckily, at the last minute, a small amount of chloroform was found. The surgery was completed under candlelight in the hut. The whole procedure took 55 minutes to complete, and Blackborough did not flinch once. On August 23rd, the pack ice surrounded the island. Even if a rescue ship could arrive, it could not reach the island. The ship's storekeeper, Orlays, believed the no stockpiling policy Wilde had orientated had been a disaster. There were no signs of a rescue, food supplies were running dangerously low, and no more penguins were coming ashore. He wrote, "We shall have to eat the one who dies first. There's many a true word said in jest." Wilde now seriously turned to the possibility of making a boat trip to Deception Island. Shackleton told him to head there if he did not return by spring. A plan to set out by October 5th if no rescue arrived, in the hope of meeting a whaling ship. 3 days after Shackleton had arrived in Stromness, he acquired a whaling ship named the Southern Sky and set off for Elephant Island to rescue the 21 men. It was ready to set sail on May 22nd. As he approached Elephant Island, he saw an impenetrable barrier of ice 70 miles across. The ship was not made for breaking through the ice. It had to return defeated. It turned and went to Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands to make a new plan. Once he reached Port Stanley, Shackleton informed London of his whereabouts and requested an ice-breaking vessel be sent south for a rescue operation. They informed him that no such vessel was able until October. Shackleton, realizing that this would be far too late, he then asked help from the British minister in Montevideo. He obtained from the Uruguay government a trawler. He readied it and headed to the south on June 10th. But again, he was blocked by the massive pack ice. Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean went to the Punta Arenas and met with Alan MacDonald, the British owner of a schooner named Emma. The ship was equipped for another rescue attempt. They left on July 12th, but the gigantic pack ice defeated the men yet again. 3 attempts now ended in failure to reach the stranded sailors. Now it was mid-August, 3 months after Shackleton had left Elephant Island. Shackleton met with the Chilean Navy, and he asked them to lend him a steam tug named the Yelko that had assisted them on their 3rd attempt. An agreement was made, and they were to set out on August 25th, captained by Louis Pardo. Shackleton noted this time that the seas were open, able to approach close to the island. Thick fog, 11:40 a.m., August 30th. Meanwhile, back on Elephant Island, having constant lookouts in place, the morning of the 30th, the fog began to lift. As Hurley looked out to the sea and he spotted a vessel, he immediately called out, "Ship ho!" Marston shouted, "Wilde, there's a ship. Haven't we better light a flare?" All the men flooded to the beach. Shackleton and Worsley acquired a lifeboat and rowed to the shore. He later wrote, "We saw the tiny black figures hurry to the beach and wave signals to us. As I came nearer, I called out, 'Are you all well?' Wilde answered, 'We are all well, boss.' Shackleton did it. He saved every single man on his expedition within an hour. All the men were safely on the Yelko. They were now headed for home. All the men drank and celebrated the rescue. Their horrible ordeal finally over. But this is not the end of the story. There was another ship on the expedition, the Aurora. Their party name was the Ross Sea Party. This part of the story is often untold. They left Hobart on December 24, 1914, and arrived in McMurdo Sound on January 15, 1915. Arriving later than planned, the leader, Ananias McIntosh, made plans for laying out the depots across the Ross ice shelf. Since the plan was for Shackleton to attempt crossing during that first season, neither the men or the dogs were acclimated to the weather, as they were very inexperienced on the ice. The first journey resulted in the loss of 10 of the party's 18 dogs. All the men suffered from frostbite. Their only achievement was one incomplete depot set on the ice shelf. By May 7th, the Aurora was anchored in the headquarters at Cape Evans. She was wrenched from her moorings during a strong gale that carried her with the drifting ice far out to sea. She was unable to return to McMurdo Sound to retrieve the land party. The Aurora was trapped in the ice for 9 months, drifting around 1,600 miles. On February 12, 1916, she finally reached the open waters and was let go from the ice. She limped back to New Zealand. A great portion of the party's food, fuel, clothing, and equipment was on board the ship. It had not been brought ashore yet. The sledging rations for the depots had been landed, but a large portion was still on the ship. The stranded shore party had to resupply and re-equip itself with leftovers from previous missions that had been based at Camp Evans a few years earlier. Now they were able to begin laying out depots for the 1915 season, not knowing that Shackleton's party had failed. Over the next few months, the depots were laid out at 1-degree intervals across the Ross ice shelf to the foot of the Beardmore Glacier as planned. They're supposed to wait there for Shackleton's overland party to meet them and make their way back all together assisting him. But this never happened. They started the return journey and many of the party contracted scurvy. The expedition's chaplain and photographer Arnold Spencer Smith collapsed and he died on the ice. The rest of the party reached a temporary shelter at Hut Point, a shelter built from the previous Discovery expedition at the south end of McMurdo Sound, the same expedition that Ernest Shackleton got his first taste of the Arctic in from 1901 to 1904. They stayed there to recover until May 8, 1916, when McIntosh and Hayward decided to walk across the unstable sea ice to Cape Evans. They were caught in a blizzard and they were never seen again. The remaining survivors eventually made their way back to Cape Evans. The Aurora was repaired in New Zealand. It was delayed for some time since the expedition was completely out of funds, but there was no other alternative for financing the operation. Finally, the governments of Australia, New Zealand, and Great Britain agreed to fund the refitting of the Aurora, but they insisted on having a joint committee to control the relief expedition. When Shackleton finally arrived back from saving the men at Elephant Island, he made his way to New Zealand. He was allowed to join the rescue party and travel on the Aurora. He'd arrived too late to plan the rescue. They left on December 20th, 1916. On January 10, 1917, the Aurora reached Cape Evans. The survivors were astonished to see Shackleton on the rescue ship, finally learning their suffering and hard work setting up the depots had been for nothing. Shackleton had never made it to the continent. They spent another week searching for the bodies of McIntosh and Hayward. They were never found. With the 7 survivors on board, the Aurora made its way for New Zealand. News of the arrival of the survivors in 1916 and in 1917 was overshadowed by news from the Great War. The rescue party arrived in central Chile, getting a warm welcome, and then repatriated. They returned home in piecemeal during a troubling time during the Great War. They did not receive honors or civic receptions. Many of the men quickly joined the Army and Navy. McCarthy and Cheatham were both killed in action. Ernest Wild of the Ross Sea Party and Frank Wild's younger brother died of typhoid in the Mediterranean. Many others were wounded in the Great War and received decorations for gallantry. Shackleton was employed during the last weeks of the war with the rank of major. Survivors from the expedition went on other expeditions after the war. Shackleton also organized one final Arctic expedition, the Shackleton Expedition, on the Quest, which left London on September 17, 1921. Wild, Worsley, Macklin, McElroy, Hussey, Kerr, McLeod, and Green all sailed with Shackleton on the Quest. Shackleton had tried for years to get himself and his crew recognized for their expedition. He finally succeeded, getting many of his sailors to receive the Polar Medal. Shackleton recommended that Chippy McNish, despite his efforts building and sailing on the James Caird voyage, be denied the medal due to his insubordination on the ice that day, questioning Shackleton's leadership and his command. He never forgave McNish for his insubordination. He also felt that Vincent, Stevenson, and Holness all fell short of his expectations. All four of these men were denied the Polar Medal. Shackleton died of a heart attack on January 5, 1922, while the Quest was anchored at South Georgia Island. After his death, the expedition was abandoned. Wild led a brief cruise which brought them back in sight of Elephant Island. They anchored off Cape Wild and were able to see landmarks from their old camp. Conditions at sea made it impossible for them to land. It would be more than 40 years before the first crossing of Antarctica was achieved, from 1955 to 1958. The Commonwealth Trans-Antarctic Expedition. They set off from Vassal Bay, the same bay Shackleton was in sight of when the Endurance became trapped in the ice some 40 years before. They followed a route which avoided the Beardmore Glacier altogether and bypassed much of the Ross Ice Shelf, reaching McMurdo Sound by descending the Skeleton Glacier. Their journey took 98 days, finally ending the race to cross the Antarctic continent. And that is the story of the Endurance. It's hard to believe that all the men that were on the Endurance survived. Now, not everybody in the entire expedition survived. 3 people died. The one guy died on the ice and the 2 were lost in the blizzard. Imagine, everybody that was on the Endurance survived. That is unbelievable. Some of them went actually insane. There's other details that I left out of that. The men doing some pretty horrible things when they got to Elephant Island. I'm not going to mention it here, but you can easily go and look at it. The men basically, when they hit land at Elephant Island, went absolutely bat crazy and started doing some horrible things right when they got on the island. We'll give them a pass, I suppose. They were trapped for so long on that ice, and it's amazing that we still have photos and videos from this. Absolutely amazing. Now, it's a very interesting time in our history, and I absolutely love this story. I've loved it since I was a child, and yeah, thanks for letting me share it with you. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I had a blast making it. And we'll see you on the next. Peace.